Have you ever worked for something so hard, so relentlessly, that you thought nothing in this world could take it away from you? That was me. My name is Lily, and if you enjoy shocking family betrayal and revenge stories, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place, because this story still chills me when I think about it. For years I worked day and night, sacrificing every weekend, every bit of rest just to pay off the mortgage of the house my family and I lived in. That house wasn't just bricks and walls to me. It was safety, it was proof that I could hold everything together even when life tried to break me apart. Every overtime shift, every late-night drive home, every cup of cheap coffee I chugged at 3 a.m. was for that house. And finally the day came. The debt was gone. The mortgage, erased. I stood outside the bank with the paperwork in my hand, my chest swelling with pride. I couldn't wait to tell my family. When I got home I spread the papers on the kitchen table. "Mom, David," I said, my voice trembling with joy, "we're free. The house is ours, no more mortgage." My mother's lips curved into a wide smile, and my brother clapped his hands as if we had just won the lottery. "Finally," he said. "That's amazing, Lily." They hugged me, their laughter ringing through the house. But something in their faces unsettled me. It wasn't just happiness, it was too sharp, too eager, almost greedy. I brushed it off, telling myself they were simply relieved. After all, wasn't I relieved too? The next day I went to work as usual. It was a long shift, and the whole time I replayed their smiles in my head. Maybe we'd celebrate that night. Maybe I'd finally get to breathe. But when I turned the corner onto our street, my stomach dropped. There were people I had never seen before standing in front of our house. A man leaned against a moving truck. Another carried boxes inside. "Excuse me," I called out, forcing my voice steady. "What are you doing here?" The man straightened, looked at me with confusion, then shrugged. "We bought this house. Just moving in." I froze. "That's impossible. This house isn't for sale. It's paid off, it's ours." He gave me a strange look, pity mixed with annoyance. "Look, lady, we have the papers. We're the new owners." My legs felt weak as I stumbled toward the front door. And then I saw it, taped to the door, fluttering in the evening breeze. A note. My hands shook as I tore it free. The handwriting was my mother's. "Lily, we sold the house. David and I moved. Don't call us. Don't try to find us. This is goodbye." The words blurred as my eyes burned with tears. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Slowly I turned my head toward the yard. My suitcases, my belongings, everything I owned, had been thrown carelessly into the garden like trash. And in that moment, as I stood frozen in front of strangers living in what had been my home, I understood something horrifying. My own family had betrayed me in the cruelest way imaginable. When your world collapses in a single night, you don't sleep. I sat on the cold ground of the garden until dawn, my suitcases beside me, watching strangers carry boxes into the house I had sacrificed everything for. My body ached, but it was my heart that throbbed the loudest, every beat asking the same question: how could they do this to me? The note crumpled in my fist felt like poison, the words searing into my skin. My mother. My brother. The people who were supposed to protect me, celebrate with me, love me. Instead, they had gutted me like I was nothing more than an obstacle in their way. At sunrise, I dragged my belongings to the sidewalk and called a cab. I didn't even know where to go. I checked into a small, cheap motel with peeling wallpaper and buzzing fluorescent lights. That room smelled of dampness and cigarettes, but at least it had a lock on the door. A lock that I controlled. The first few days I was numb. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was always circling back to the same image. My mother smiling too wide, my brother's greedy applause. Their excitement hadn't been about freedom. It had been about opportunity. And slowly I began to understand, I couldn't just sit here waiting for answers. I needed to find them. So I started digging. I visited the county records office. My hands trembled as I scrolled through recent property transfers. There was in black and white. Our family home sold at a price far lower than it was worth. And the signatures? My mother's. My brother's. My name was nowhere to be found. Legal. Fraudulent. But still done. I asked neighbors what they had seen. Mrs. Caldwell, the elderly woman next door, said she'd noticed my brother meeting with a man in a suit several times over the past month. "Shady type," she whispered. Kept looking over his shoulder. Another neighbor, a young couple across the street, admitted they saw moving trucks the night before I came home. Your mom and brother seemed in a hurry, the husband said. They didn't even say goodbye. Every word drove the knife deeper, but it also fueled something inside me. Bigger. Determination. If they thought they could erase me from my own life, they were wrong. One evening, sitting in that dim motel room, I opened my laptop and traced the buyer's name from the property record. It led me to a real estate firm, one that specialized in quick cash deals for people drowning in debt. Debt. That explained the desperation. My brother had always been reckless with money, chasing get-rich-quick schemes. And my mother, well, she had always shielded him no matter how much it cost me. I had spent years paying for their mistakes, but this time this betrayal was unforgivable. My suspicion hardened into certainty. They had sold me out to cover his debts. The image of their smiling faces when I shared the mortgage news replayed in my head, but now I saw it for what it was. Not joy, not relief, but triumph. They had already decided. They were already planning their escape. I closed my laptop, my reflection faint in the darkened screen. My eyes looked hollow, but behind them a fire was starting. They thought they could vanish, leave me broken and homeless. But I had already found the first thread of their trail. And I was going to follow it, until I unraveled everything. Nights at the motel stretched endlessly. The hum of the broken air conditioner was my only companion as I sat cross-legged on the sagging bed, surrounded by papers that told the story of my family's betrayal. Every piece of evidence I collected was like a shard of glass, cutting, painful, but impossible to let go of. I kept asking myself, was there ever a time they loved me? Or had I always been just a means to an end? By day I worked like a ghost, going through the motions at the office. By night I turned into an investigator, combing through every public record I could access. My laptop glowed in the dim motel light, illuminating the shadows under my eyes. Coffee cups and empty takeout containers piled up around me like trophies of obsession. It was during one of these long nights that I noticed a detail in the property transfer record I had almost missed. The notary's stamp looked smudged, incomplete. That tugged at something inside me. Why smudge an official stamp unless you were rushing? Unless you were hiding something? I needed the full file. So on Friday I marched into the county clerk's office again, my heart hammering. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with glasses slipping down her nose, seemed reluctant at first. But when I insisted, she finally slid a thick folder across the counter. The weight of it was almost unbearable. I carried it to a corner table, opened it, and felt the air leave my lungs. There it was, the contract for the sale of my house. My mother's name signed neatly, my brother's messy scrawl beside it. And then my name. I stared at it for a long time, tracing the letters with my finger. My signature, but not mine. The loops too wide, the slant too steep. My hand knows the truth even when my heart hesitates. And my hand screamed, "This is not yours." My breath quickened. My chest felt tight, almost crushing. They hadn't just betrayed me. They had stolen my very identity. I leaned back in the stiff wooden chair, memories flooding in. I remembered being 16, begging my mother to let me get a part-time job so I could save for college. She said no. Your place is at home helping with your brother. But when David wanted money for a road trip, she emptied her savings without hesitation. I remembered coming home from my first full-time job, exhausted but proud, only to hear her whisper to a neighbor, "Lily's tough, she'll manage. David needs more support." Support. That word haunted me. For her, support meant draining me dry to keep him afloat. And now they had pushed it to the extreme. My childhood home sold. My name stolen. My life discarded. I left the clerk's office gripping the folder like it contained my soul. I didn't even stop for food. I found a quiet cafe, ordered the cheapest coffee, and spread the documents across the table. My hands shook so badly that the cup rattled against the saucer. That's when I knew I needed help. The next morning I sat in the office of Claire Reynolds, the attorney recommended by a colleague. The space smelled of leather and old books, shelves lined with thick law journals. Claire herself was sharp-eyed, her dark suit perfectly pressed, her presence commanding. She listened in silence as I told my story, only interrupting once to ask for the papers. When she saw the signatures, she barely blinked. "These are forgeries," she said flatly. "Not even good ones. Whoever signed this thought you'd never see the file." Her voice was calm, but inside me something cracked open. A mix of relief, fury, and vindication surged through me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. They really had crossed the line. Claire folded her hands. Lily, this isn't just a family dispute anymore. Forgery is fraud. Real estate fraud. This could lead to prison time. We can file a civil suit to get the house back and pursue criminal charges if you want. Prison. The word echoed in my head, almost intoxicating. I nodded, though my throat felt dry. The thought of my mother, my own mother, behind bars should have horrified me. But it didn't. Not after what she had done. Not after what they had stolen. When I left Claire's office, the city seemed sharper, louder. Car horns, chatter, footsteps. It all felt like background noise to the storm building inside me. I clutched the folder to my chest as if it were armor. As it was. For the first time since that night in front of my house, I felt something other than despair. I felt power. They thought their note would end my story. But in reality, it was just the beginning. When Claire told me the court had granted the injunction, I felt the ground tilt beneath me in the best possible way. For the first time in weeks, I slept without the prickling fear of having nowhere to go. But sleep was a luxury I couldn't indulge for long. The injunction was a pause, not a victory. They had taken everything from me. Now I had to take back not just the house but the public truth about what they'd done. Revenge, I learned quickly, is a series of small, precise moves rather than one grand explosion. It is the quiet rearrangement of facts until the world can no longer ignore them. So I made a list. Not a plan for violence or ruin but a ledger of exposures. Legal, social, and relentless. First, the law. Claire and I filed the civil complaint immediately and served papers not only to my mother and David but to the new buyers and the real estate agent who handled the sale. We attached the forged documents, notarization questions, and a timeline of my payments. We also filed a lease pendens on the property, an official notice that there was a dispute tied to the house. It didn't destroy the buyers, but it put a legal cloud over the property that made banks, insurers, and anyone looking at the house think twice. The deal stalled. That was the point. Next, I went after the truth in public ways that couldn't be laughed off as family drama. I handed copies of the forged contract and the notarized discrepancies to the county prosecutor's office. I filed a formal complaint with the state real estate board about the agent who moved the transaction along. I wasn't vindictive for the sake of cruelty. I wanted the paperwork examined by people whose job it was to see through lies. Those offices moved slowly, but they moved. And movement meant consequences could arrive. I also hired a private investigator. Yes, the kind of thing I'd once thought only happened in movies. But this PI did something simple and legal. He documented my brother's meetings, the rapid cash withdrawals, the string of unusual errands that all pointed to the same thing: desperation dressed up as planning. He found witnesses who would speak under oath about seeing my mother and David sign papers, about odd late-night meetings at the diner with men who didn't belong in our lives. Silence had been their shield. Documentation was my countershield. While legal engines ground, I worked the social machinery. I tapped into the one currency my mother and brother still had: reputation. People who had smiled when they saw them began to hear a different hum. I didn't scream accusations in grocery aisles. I sat across from old neighbors and brought tea. "Did you see the sale papers?" I'd ask casually. "Did you notice anything odd with the notary stamp?" I'm trying to put together a timeline. Those conversations seeded doubt. Where there had been polite indifference, there was now curiosity. Where there had been excuses, there were questions. I also reached out to the buyer's attorney directly. Civil, measured, professional. "There's litigation pending," I wrote. "We have reason to believe the signatures were forged." No threats, just facts. Lawyers hate uncertainty. They hate the risk of representing a client whose title might not be clean. The buyers stopped answering celebratory calls. Their moving boxes sat in the garage while their escrow company chewed through the red tape. The house they had gleefully claimed became, for a time, a legal hot potato. At home, my mother and David fumbled. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that David had been furious at first, threatening texts, slam of doors, but then he calmed into a pale, cold fear. My mother called an old friend and cried on the phone, begging for advice, for patience, for the world to forget. They had not expected anyone to fight back. They had assumed I would crumble. They were miscalculating. I didn't stop with paperwork and polite calls. I reclaimed what they could not replace: the story. I wrote a clear, concise timeline and handed it to a local reporter I trusted. Someone who'd covered courthouse stories with empathy rather than sensationalism. I didn't dramatize. I presented proof, witnesses, and dates. She didn't run a viral headline the next day, but the lullaby of silence that had covered them was ripped by the sound of questions. People began to talk. Old friends who had previously sided with my mother now asked gentle, awkward questions at church, at the market, in line at the pharmacy. Gossip turned into scrutiny. There were low points. One night a stranger left a voicemail. "Drop it, Lily. This will get messy if you don't." Fear still crept in. But fear and anger are different beasts. Fear can make you run. Anger can make you plan. I used the anger. With Claire's advice, I documented every threatening message, every encounter. If David pushed too far, it would not be my word against his. It would be on record. That alone pulled a thread of protection around me. Some of my actions felt petty and strangely satisfying. I arranged, legally and publicly, for a neighborhood meeting to discuss community safety and shady real estate practices. I didn't single them out by name, but they were there when the talk turned to rushed sales and sudden relocations. Eyes met eyes across the pews and at the coffee stand. Those are quiet humiliations, but humiliations leave cracks. People watch and file away what they see. I retrieved things too. Family photos had been tossed among the suitcases in the yard. With a judge's temporary order, I was allowed back briefly to secure sentimental items. I took pictures of the scattered boxes, logged missing items, and reclaimed grandmother's locket that had hung in my kitchen for years. If they thought they could erase my history by tossing it in the dirt, they were wrong. I gathered evidence and memories with equal care. There were ethical knives to navigate. I could have leaned into vengeance that would have crossed lines. Blackmail, fabricated claims, orchestrated ruin. I didn't. I wanted to be better than the people who had betrayed me. My revenge would be anchored in law and in truth, and in exposing their choices so the world could see them for what they were. And yet, I admit I let myself small cruelties, tactical and harmless. I sent a handwritten card to our old neighbors. Polite, warm, thanking them for years of friendship and reminding them to check official notices if anyone ever offered them a fast cash deal. I left anonymous, factual letters for the buyers describing the pending litigation. I didn't lie. I did not fabricate. I let the documents speak. But watching them pick up the phone in confusion, seeing the buyer's lawyer call their client in a panic, felt like the slow tightening of a rope around their certainty. My mother called me once from an unknown number, pleading, ashamed, sharp in turns. "Lily, we made a bad choice. We thought we had no way out," she whispered. I could hear David in the background offering another version, a practiced line. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I listened to them try to justify theft as survival. I let them talk themselves into corners. Words age quickly when they are used to hide crimes. All the while, Claire prepared the courtroom choreography. Depositions scheduled. Witnesses lined up. The PI's reports were summarized into exhibits. The county's fraud investigators were circling. My mother's voice on the phone had been the voice of a scared woman. In depositions, she started to sound like someone who had rehearsed excuses. The more she spoke, the more the cracks widened. At night, when the motel lights flickered and the world softened into sleep, I would sit with a cup of tea and the folder of documents beside me. I no longer felt hollow. I felt focused. Revenge had stopped being revenge and become reclamation. It was about rights and dignity and the small justice of seeing falsehood unmasked in plain light. One evening, weeks into the legal slog, I walked by the house again. There was a moving truck gone, boxes half unpacked. A for sale sign had been nailed to a post, odd and premature, like someone was trying to peel away the scandal with new business. Taped to that post, fluttering in the wind, was the county's notice. Lease pendens. Litigation pending. The new owners' faces at the window were sharp with panic. I smiled quietly and without triumph. This was not the end. But it was a beginning that smelled of paper and court orders and the small civil dignity of a fight fought the right way. They had written a note that said, "Don't call us. Don't try to find us." They had thought they could vanish with my life in their back pocket. Instead, they found themselves visible, documented, questioned, and, most of all, remembered for what they were. And while Claire prepared the final motions, while the prosecutor readied the file, I stood at the edge of it all and felt something unfamiliar. Not the savage joy of watching someone break, but the calm satisfaction of a woman bringing the truth to a place where it could no longer hide. The last text I received that week was short, from an unknown number. "You should stop. We can fix this quietly. I typed back a single sentence that made my fingers steady. No. I already fixed mine. The case would go before the judge soon. Evidence would be laid out, and in that sterile courtroom, paper would have the final say. I had already written the outline of what would happen. Now I had to wait for the world to read it. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and nervous sweat. I sat at the plaintiff's table, Claire at my side, the forged documents neatly stacked in front of us. Across the aisle, my mother and David avoided my eyes. My mother's face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line, while David bounced his leg under the table, restless, trapped. The judge entered and silence fell like a heavy curtain. Claire began her opening statement with calm precision. Your Honor, this case is not about a family dispute. It is about fraud, about the theft of property through forged signatures and deceit. She lifted the papers high enough for everyone in the room to see. These signatures are not my clients. They are criminal forgeries. The judge nodded and suddenly the floor was mine. I stood, my legs shaking but my voice steady. Your Honor, I worked for years to pay off that house. Every cent, every hour came from me. And when I finally cleared the mortgage, my family took it away overnight. They sold it without my consent, without my knowledge, and they forged my name to do it. For the first time I looked at my mother. Her eyes were wet, but I didn't see remorse. I saw fear. David stared at the table, refusing to meet my gaze. The courtroom held its breath as the county fraud investigator took the stand. He pointed out the inconsistencies in the signatures, the irregular notary stamp, the falsified documents. This is textbook real estate fraud, he said flatly. Then came the neighbors. Mrs. Caldwell's frail voice trembled as she told the court about late-night meetings she'd seen. The young couple described the rushed moving trucks. Piece by piece the puzzle came together. Finally, Claire called the private investigator. His report detailed David's pattern of cash withdrawals, his meetings with known loan sharks, his financial desperation. Each word stripped away their defense. When the judge finally turned to my mother and David, their lawyer tried to spin a story of family misunderstanding. But under cross-examination, David snapped. His voice cracked as he admitted to maybe helping with the paperwork, and when pressed further he blurted, "We didn't have a choice, okay? We needed the money." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. My mother closed her eyes as if she could disappear. The judge leaned forward, his tone sharp. Need does not excuse fraud. Forging your daughter's signature to steal her home is not a misunderstanding. It is a crime. The gavel came down like thunder. The sale was declared void. Ownership of the house was restored to me. The buyers were compensated by the real estate firm's insurance, but the court ordered further investigation into my mother and brother's actions. The word felony hung in the air like a shadow over their future. I walked out of that courthouse holding the deed in my hand. My fingers traced my own signature, real, not forged. For the first time in months I felt whole. Returning to the house was surreal. The walls were the same, the rooms unchanged, but the air was different. It no longer carried the weight of betrayal. It carried my victory, my survival. I stood in the doorway, looking out at the garden where my belongings had once been thrown like garbage. Now I stood taller, the rightful owner. The home was mine again, not because they gave it to me but because I fought for it. That night as I walked through the empty rooms, I whispered to myself, "This is my house and my justice." And to you listening now, what would you have done in my place? Would you have fought or walked away? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe because the next story might remind you that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who cut the deepest. But they're also the ones who underestimate how strong we really are.